tanks, artillery, rockets, all firing at the same time.
These government fighters have brought in their artillery, their heavy machine guns, but it really is
It's been amazing to see these great long food queues, to see how many people are donating food, how big the need is. The great thing about my job is, I've been doing it for more than 30 years and I never stop learning.
All right, what's up, y'all? I'm really excited about today's show. We have on Jonathan Head. Jonathan is the Southeast Asia correspondent for BBC News. He's an award-winning journalist, including the coveted MBE and the Peabody Award for his work in the plight of the Rohingya, where he filmed villages in Myanmar that were set alight. Jonathan's been a correspondent in Bangkok, in Tokyo, in Singapore, Indonesia, all the way to Istanbul, and now back in Bangkok, where we've been working together for about 5 years. So I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Jonathan on the show. So Jonathan, welcome to Behind the News.
Well, it's very nice to be talking like this rather than running around getting sweaty together, which is mostly what we've done for the last 5 years.
For sure, definitely. And of course, we're in odd times now with the COVID. So how have you been coping in Bangkok, and have you seen Bangkok change?
Well, of course, none of us are seeing as much of Bangkok as we like, and we do get out. It's been very, very quiet. Of course, mostly our job here in Bangkok is not just covering this city or even just Thailand, but traveling, and that's just something we can't do. And in fact, my home here in Bangkok is mostly what I've been seeing for the last 6 weeks. It's a very frustrating time for any journalist who's used to working in the field. We've all had to be a bit more inventive. We've all had to seek out information. We've certainly become more adept at using different forms of technology, recording interviews online. Maybe it will offer pointers to the way in which we may work in future.
With the virus, what's your sense now as our numbers in Thailand? Is the continual question of why are our numbers so low?
Yeah, look, I think everything about this virus is new, and that's one of the most extraordinary aspects of it as a subject for journalists to report. Almost everything else we've ever reported, if you think about wars, natural disasters, political crises, any kind of social developments, you've got quite a lot of dependable information. You've got a lot of other examples which you can use as parallels. So in general, you can combine the information you find out in the course of your work together with a great deal of background to come up with a pretty reliable assessment of what's going on. It's really different with this virus. It's fascinating. I mean, getting beyond the horrible impact it's having on all of our lives, to have a subject where even the experts often don't know. When it comes to Thailand, the one thing we do know is that the numbers are very low here, impressively low. We only had lower than single figures, lower than 10 in the last few days. And, the government is very pleased about that. And certainly it took some good measures initially. People were very tuned in to how serious this virus was very early on. Thailand has a relatively effective health system. All of those have helped. But the fact is, right across Southeast Asia, even in countries like Indonesia, where they haven't been anything like as effective, their own officials privately say they did pretty much everything wrong. They've got a huge population. Even their numbers, even allowing for the fact they're probably bigger than the official ones, are much, much lower than we've seen in the States and in Europe. And we just don't really know why. It could be weather, could be many other things. So, we're seeing official numbers, we're seeing developments in this story, but there's still a great deal we don't really understand.
And we've been out the last week in Thailand, so we've seen people who have been lining up at food banks. And so maybe talk a bit about that, about what's going on with the economics of Thailand and how people are getting through this time.
Yeah, I think that's one area where I think Thailand is quite a good example for the rest of the world to look at, because we've been so focused on the virus and what you have to do to curb it, and our real fear. I mean, it kills people, it's knocked out economies and societies. For the moment, everybody is focused on just dealing with the immediate impact of the virus and staying safe and adapting to the new way we're having to live. But in huge parts of the world, lockdowns have, a far worse effect than they have even in very advanced industrialized societies, because so many people have casual incomes, casual jobs, very, very marginal incomes too. They live day to day, they have no savings. We've seen that in Thailand. It's quite surprising. This country is not categorized as a poor country anymore. Actually, if you look at the World Bank figures, Thailand is judged to be on the cusp of becoming an upper income country. It has spectacularly eradicated poverty. in recent years we've had completely full employment. Almost everybody who wants a job can get it. You do see poverty here, but nothing like the scale you see it even in places like the Philippines nearby. And yet, once this crisis hit, you've got millions and millions of people whose jobs just evaporated overnight and who are really struggling. And I think, we've been out to see that. It's been amazing to see these great long food queues, to see how many people are donating food, how big the need is, the incredible scenes where people went to the finance ministry because they hadn't been eligible for the government's cash handout. I mean, 28 million people applied for that cash handout. That's something like 75% of the working population. That gives you an idea how big the pressures are. And I think that raises a different issue that is not having to be addressed quite so acutely in places like Europe and the United States, which is when your COVID numbers are really low, and you've kept them really low, and the economic hardship, the impact is so dire that it probably has its own negative health outcomes. Governments here probably need to be making different calculations about the risk of COVID breaking out versus the damage done to their economies. And many governments are kind of more or less, you look at Indonesia, saying, frankly, we cannot have complete lockdowns. If we have a complete lockdown, we just fall apart. We have to be softer in our approach and allow for more infections than people are doing in Europe.
So you've been working in this industry for a long time. You ever seen anything like this?
That's an interesting one. I haven't. I don't think anybody has. First of all, it's completely global. We've got the same story in every country where my colleagues are based, of course, with huge variations. But the fact is, it is the only story in every place where the BBC has a bureau. Whereas normally you've got a huge diversity of stories coming from around the world. It's knocked everything else off the news agenda, but it's also crippled the way in which we work. I mean, even in dire war zones, we usually find a way to get in. There's a few parts of the world that we've always found very, very difficult. North Korea, obviously, you only get in there with sort of, on government trips. Some wars are extremely challenging and do require massive amounts of planning and minimal numbers of teams going in. But for all of that, to have a situation where the health requirements and the safety requirements mean that you just can't travel for a start. You can't. In Thailand, it's difficult even to travel between provinces. When you go out, you've got to keep your distance from the people you're interviewing. You've got to do more and more on screen rather than going out face to face, which we all prefer. You get much more from people meeting them face to face. So the way in which we're having to work and the sheer universality of this story and the fact that it affects all of us. I mean, some of my colleagues are writing not about covering people with COVID-19, but about their own infections. Some of them have been really ill. So it's a quite unique story, that, in the fact that we're all sharing this same problem.
And you were around for SARS. In the beginning, did you feel like this was going to be something like SARS? It would start, then it would disappear, or did it feel different?
Because all these things always start with very little information. I mean, one thing people forget about SARS is that there were reports of these deaths in southern China going around actually for months before we really started getting a sense of it, before the infections really took off in places like Hong Kong. And at that time, China was more secretive than it has been this time. That the gap between the first infections, we think, and them finally coming clean about what was going on was much, much longer. By the time it took off, very quickly, I mean, it was very unnerving that the death rate was very high. But quite quickly, it became clear that it was not spreading that quickly. Now, when this one started, the only information we had was from coming out of China, but it very quickly became very alarming. Even in January, we were getting reports of huge numbers of people queuing up in hospitals, of doctors being overwhelmed, and you had Wuhan completely shut down. There was a sense then that this was going to be different. And once we started seeing spikes in infections outside China, and we started getting better information about just how badly impacted the Chinese health system was in the areas where the outbreaks were big, it was definitely a different kind of a disease. At that stage, still, you couldn't be too sure. Was it going to spread all over the world? Was it going to completely shut down economies? It was a possibility. You could see it was a possibility. But lots of stories we've had. SARS, I think, at one point, there was a possibility, a worry about it spreading, but it didn't last very long. It was fairly early on, once we heard about the disease, that we realized whilst it was having very bad outcomes for those who were infected, it wasn't spreading that easily.
So, I mean, you mentioned some of the other stories like SARS and preparing to go into war zones and things like that. Something I want to get out of these is for people who are starting out and to kind of hear some of your most intense or crazier stories you've worked on. So maybe you can share a couple of those.
I often wonder whether we should do that or not, because I think, when you think about the job of being a journalist, you always remember your most incredible experiences. But of course, most of your work is really quite routine. Right. A great deal of time, as you and I know, is spent sitting around thinking about stories that you may be able to report that you can't even interest your editors in. And even when you can interest them, there's a lot of waiting until the pieces fall into place, whether it'll even work, whether the right people will speak to you. And then you've got routine kinds of jobs where you go to cover your press conferences and you sit around for hours and hours because the people giving it are late and nothing good comes out of it. There's a great deal of waiting around. Even in wars, there's a lot of waiting around with nothing happening. That's the reality of journalism, I suspect many other jobs. I think everyone in their career approaches stories differently, and for journalism is driven in a lot of cases by idealism, by a sense of adventure, by a real sense of excitement about the job itself. It's one of those few jobs which it's why people love doing it. It really is an adventure, and people who get into it are highly motivated. So the first big stories you cover really imprint themselves on your memory. For me, it was being based in Indonesia. I did 4 years there. It was my first post as a foreign correspondent. I went out at the very beginning of 1996 and left at the very end of 1999. And when I went to Indonesia, I personally had a huge interest in the country. I really always wanted to be a reporter there, so I was motivated. But news-wise, it was dead quiet. It was a country that didn't really have much of an impact on other countries, despite its size. It had been ruled by the same man for nearly 30 years. There was repression, there were conflicts, but everything was very well controlled by the government, and it didn't generate a great deal of news. And in some ways, that was ideal, because I was trying to figure out even how you do this thing, being a foreign correspondent. My first time, I had to sit down and write these voice pieces for the BBC. I can knock them off now in 20 minutes. I was worried a lot more, and I didn't write them as well.
Sure.
It gave me a chance to learn, to make mistakes without being in the glare of a really important story where the editors are really counting on you. But by the beginning of 1998, Indonesia had started to shake quite badly under the impact of the then Asian financial crisis. And the rule of General Suharto, who had dominated the country for 3 decades, he was getting old, began to crack. And when it finally did crack, it didn't follow any kind of script. Nobody had predicted it. Many people thought Suharto would survive. He'd seen off so many other crises, and yet, it was quite extraordinary. We had this incredible protests, clashes, people being killed for the first time on the streets and clash with the police, then rioting, then Suharto stepping down, and after that, when we had a change of government, there was a lot of chaos, there were a lot of conflicts, and I found myself literally every 2 to 3 weeks running from one place to the other. It's a big country. And while a lot of the political unrest was on the main island of Java, we had ethnic conflicts breaking out, often very violent, very dramatic. There were conflicts, in particular in the island of Borneo, where a couple of ethnic groups tried to drive out an unwanted ethnic group, and it all became very, very savage. We had, heads being chopped off. It was completely wild, stuff you never expected to see. And we also got quite involved in the story of East Timor, which is a half of an island that Indonesia had invaded. It had been Portuguese administered before then, and very brutally occupied. And the East Timorese had a resistance movement that had been fighting a lonely battle against Indonesian rule. And after the fall of Suharto, that it became possible to go there. They'd previously been very, very limited. We got far more access, but also the Indonesians started considering the possibility of letting East Timor go. And the actual story of the birth of this little half-island nation was itself very dramatic, and we were all very much inside it and consumed by it. I would argue we felt like more than journalists. We felt very committed to it as well. I'm quite glad that those sorts of stories I covered while I was still young, idealistic, very passionate. I do them differently today. I look back now on some of the ways I reported then and think, well, I shouldn't have done it that way. But you never forget that kind of a story.
Well, so, it's funny, maybe it's not funny, but you talk about these things like the head cuttings, but you just talk about them like in like a pass through like a statement. But for somebody who hasn't seen that, you're probably thinking like, what? Wait, you saw head cuttings?
Yeah.
So when you're there, like, what is that when you see that?
Well, okay, I'll qualify. I never actually saw anybody's head being cut off, but it was a very brutal conflict that nobody had. Actually, we had seen it coming because it had happened under Suharto, but very carefully suppressed. At the time, you get so wrapped up in just driving around, seeing things, reporting them, you don't fully take on board sometimes what you're seeing. I know that some of my colleagues were quite distressed and thought very deeply about how we're supposed to report this. We had people who killed their neighbors, cut their heads off, they dismembered their bodies and did other things that were all involved in some kind of weird breakdown sort of order and some rituals, but who were actually quite nice to us. They wanted us to understand why they were doing it. So you're left in a position which journalists sometimes are, which is you're supposed to report, which you do, but do you also convey a sense of outrage? Are you supposed to say, well, this is appalling? To some degree, you don't, because you know what your job is, and also you're worried. You don't want to crack up. I was very nervous before I saw anybody's head chopped off, and I'd heard about it. And you've come across your first severed head sitting on an oil drum where someone's put it. You're with a group of colleagues, and you get out very gingerly, and the people who are guarding it a bit, they're all fired up. They've got machetes. Are they going to be all right? Then when they're kind of friendly to you, you think, okay, fine, this isn't so bad, and you're kind of almost relieved, and you think, wow, I've seen a severed head. It's a while before, usually when you've left and you've gone back to your hotel, even after you've left the area, that you think, hold on, that was someone's father, that was someone's son or brother. It's difficult as a journalist. You can't always, in the heat of the moment, absorb all this stuff. Everyone reacts differently. I've been quite lucky in that I came through a lot of very dramatic experiences in Indonesia with relatively little support. The concept of post-traumatic stress was very new then. My bosses weren't that tuned into it. I didn't get anything like the support I would get now. I did have some issues, but they weren't too serious to me. I got over them. And ever since then, I've not been too badly affected by anything I've seen, however sad, traumatic, or upsetting it is. But there's no doubt that when you cover these things, you're young and excited, and you think, wow, I've seen something nobody else has. But it does scar you. And we've all had colleagues who have been scarred, and I don't think it ever leaves you. I think it's all those experiences are with you, and you have to carry them with you, and some people carry them more easily than others.
I want to talk to you a bit about like the path to being a journalist.
Yeah.
And somebody asked me recently, actually this last week, do you need to go to school to be a journalist? She was considering to go to get her master's.
Yeah, in journalism, I see.
In journalism, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is where there's a sort of, when I started, there was a philosophical difference between the way it's done in the US and the way that it's done in UK, where I was. I think Britain rather cherishes the role of the kind of glorious amateur. There are good journalism schools in Britain, and many of my colleagues have been to them. I didn't. Sometimes I wish I had. Journalism's a craft. You can learn it. And it's far more difficult these days, but in the days when there were internships, more of them, or where newspapers had room to the resources to train people, that is the best way you're ever going to learn. I mean, the way I learned was I actually had worked briefly in the BBC after finishing my master's in Southeast Asian Studies, and I did a 9-month, was supposed to be a training scheme, but it was in a very esoteric part of BBC World Service. It was very pointy-headed and intellectual. Great place, but you didn't learn a lot about the nuts and bolts of journalism there. And I went to live in the United States, and I found that with the training I had, I was not yet equipped to go and get a mainstream job. And I did an internship with a local public radio station in Philadelphia, near where I was living. And they had a news report called 91 Report in the evenings that they put out, and they were really nice to me. They made room for me. I must have seemed like a real oddity to them, but this strange Englishman, and let me work with them and learn about day-to-day journalism. It was radio journalism that is focused on the local neighborhood. You reported the people who then listened to your show. There's a very strong connection, community connection. It was very small, a small team of 4 or 5 journalists and editor, great people, really good. I still remember them. They had such a big influence on me because I saw then what journalism really should be about, which is ultimately serving a community. They were going out, finding out about issues that they knew their audience who lived in the same neighborhoods as them would care about. It was all about schools and hospitals and local politics. It was quite rough in those days in Philadelphia. That was the best schooling I could have had. Not because I learned a lot of techniques. There was no formal training, but because watching them, I understood the essence of journalism, which is just to keep asking questions and keep trying to find out, get as close to some kind of accurate reality as you can. None of us ever gets any perfect truth. There's always multiple versions of any issue that happens. But, I think one of the people running the Neiman School in the States says the essence of journalism is idealism and skepticism. Those are great qualities to have. In addition, I think you've got to have 2 other things that are important: balance and fairness. Now, what do they mean? Balance ultimately is unless you're a polemical or activist journalist, there has to be a representation of a fair range of views on the subject. You can't get a lot in a short report, but there has to be some sense of, not just going down one path, of trying to give people a sense of an overview. The other is with fairness. Fairness is about being as fair as you can to what you think the truth of the story is and the people who are helping tell it. People come to you to do an interview and they're very excited. They're being interviewed by the media and they usually talk too much and they sometimes go off on a tangent. You know what it's like. I've done it many times. You're trying to find a point in there and it's difficult for people who aren't practiced, public speakers. And you have to cut out of there, edit out of there what you think are points that they've made that are relevant to the story. Sometimes afterwards they're disappointed. They didn't get their whole long sentence in, or they didn't get the point that they wanted to make. And people who are very experienced with the media, of course, learn very quickly to stick to one point, not even give the journalist a choice. But I think you have to, at the end of it, when you put your report together, you have to feel that you have been fair to all the people in there. So I think all those 4 qualities matter. Idealism, because you wouldn't do it otherwise. Journalists have to believe theirs is a profession that does good. Certainly doesn't pay well enough to justify doing it otherwise. Skepticism, because you've got to be skeptical all the time. Anything you hear, you've got to ask, is this really true? Balance, there's always multiple sides. Try and get some sense of balance and fairness, or justice, you could say. And if you have those inside you, I think then you can learn to be a journalist. The actual techniques, of how you write, what language you use, all the technology you use, I don't think you need to go to college for that personally. But on the other hand, you will get a fantastic grounding if you go to a really good school. I didn't, so I'm not in a very good position to say this is what you should do. It is a choice, but I don't think it's essential.
Okay, fair enough. Sounds good. I think that'll help very much to the person who had that question.
Yeah.
When we were talking about Indonesia, you kind of also reminded me about some of your stories you've told from Libya.
Yeah.
And going there with your grandfather's diary that you had at the time too. So
I think that's quite an interesting one. It's not often that you can bring any personal connection into a story. When you're a foreign correspondent, you're going off to far-flung places. You don't necessarily have any personal connection. If you can find one, I think it's always a good thing. I'd never really thought about this much before, because until 2011, when the Arab uprising started, most journalists would never, ever have expected to go to Libya. It was one of these strange places, a big kind of square on the map. Everybody knew about, mad old Colonel Gaddafi. It was a very thinly populated place, but it was hard to visit. It's a very small population. We just didn't pay a lot of attention to it unless it happened to sort of occasionally imprint itself on international news. But once the Arab uprisings happened, quite against expectations, started in Tunisia. Egypt was the main focus. Everyone knew, in Egypt there was a lot of seething unhappiness with the government there. It's quite a sophisticated country, a big kind of, population under a lot of economic stress. All the things that happened in Egypt, kind of, people could see, oh, that's expected. Nobody ever expected uprisings in Libya. To be honest, we didn't understand it well enough. Even when I went to Libya, I didn't know enough about it. But I did do 3 trips to Libya, and the second one I made, I ended up getting caught up in the battle to take Gaddafi's last stronghold, which was his hometown of Sirte, and it was real combat reporting. There were front lines shifting, there were all these militias, everyone was unbelievably well armed, there were weapons all over the place. It's the only time I've been sat in the middle with tanks, artillery, rockets, all firing at the same time. Doesn't do any good for your hearing. But it did help me that, I remembered that my grandfather, my mother's father, who was killed in the Second World War, but he fought in the desert through Libya. And it had been on my mind. And I happened to have a copy of his diary that my mother had typed out and digitized. So I had it sitting on my laptop. So I was able to go through his diary and match up the parts when he came through Sirte and eventually ended up in Tripoli. He ended up running the airfield there for a while. And it was quite nice to make that connection. And one of the reasons I like making it was because my grandfather wrote this diary because at the start of the Second World War, he volunteered, as so many men did, but he actually volunteered initially to be an air gunner on a bomber, and he didn't expect to survive. And because my mother was then very young, she was only born in 1939, he wanted to write a diary explaining to her about himself, his life, things he loved, his tastes in literature and things like that. But also he puts an explanation as to why he did it. He was in his late 30s. He didn't have to sign up. He could have gone into a much softer job. And he was trying to justify why a man who had a young daughter and a wife, in a very close relationship, why he would choose to go off and fight. And I found that one of the characters I was covering, he was a sports teacher at a school in Misrata. People may remember Misrata was a city that was very heavily bombed and besieged for a long time by Gaddafi forces, and eventually it had rebelled against Gaddafi. And as the siege lifted and Gaddafi fled to Sirte, the people in Misrata joined these volunteer militia groups who went to try and finally overthrow the last vestiges of the Gaddafi regime, and he was one of them. And I spent quite a bit of time with him. We lived with him out in a house outside Sirte. We go back to his home in Misrata. We saw his family. I think he had 6 kids. He had one very, very small baby, just probably 2 or 3 months old. And he was older than many of the other volunteers. And I talked to him and said, why do you do it? You don't have to. And the Gaddafi regime is probably on its last legs. And, it's very risky. And it really was, these last attacks on Sirte. But he very much like my grandfather, he'd argued that he just felt he had to do it. It was his country, and that he felt his country had been sort of crippled by Gaddafi, and it was their last chance. He felt they really had to make sure they finally got rid of this regime they didn't like. And so it was nice for me to be able to make that parallel between his thinking and the thinking that had been written down by my grandfather way back when he started writing his diary in 1939.
And your mother does not have memory of her father?
She has some.
But
she was only 4 years old when he was killed.
Wow.
He was very unlucky. He actually fought through the desert where he was with the RAF, and wrote grippingly about it in his diary. It's full of it, of descriptions of what it was like. And then he was on leave in June of 1943 and was very suddenly called back unexpectedly. And this was when the whole of the North African campaign was almost over, and I think they were planning for the invasion of Sicily and into Europe. Whatever it was, he was clearly needed. He had some kind of intelligence role, and he ended up on a plane that was supposed to fly from Cornwall across the Bay of Biscay to Gibraltar to meet up there with another group of people and get involved in the planning of the invasion of Sicily. And on his plane were quite high-ranking, all British officers. And the plane had engine trouble, and it was supposed to fly at night because it was very dangerous crossing the Bay of Biscay, as the German Luftwaffe then knew about planes going that way, British planes, and they had fighters ready to go and intercept them. But because his mission was so urgent, they insisted that the plane, when they fixed it, flew in daylight. And he phoned my mother's mother and told her how worried he was about it and thought it was very dangerous. and that was the last they heard of him. But in fact, the German fighter pilot who shot down his transport plane with everyone on board gave quite a detailed description of the operation. So that's available. So, but we only discovered that relatively recently. My mother actually, to that point, hadn't known what happened to her father.
So that's all while working out of Istanbul and going to Libya. So is that a completely different pace working out of the Istanbul bureau, or is it also because it was during the Arab Spring, Arab uprising, or does every bureau have a different pace, a different feel? Or
they're all different sizes, of course. Istanbul was tiny. In fact, there wasn't a bureau. When I was there, I worked from home. We'd had a very small bureau and we'd lost it. And because my family was very young, then I found it more convenient to work from home. I lived in central Istanbul. It was a nice arrangement and probably a little hard on my producer Zeynep, who had to work occasionally with my young boys as they were sort of crawling between her feet. We traveled a lot. Turkey itself wasn't a story that got on the news a lot, but it's an absolutely fascinating country. It's one of those countries where when you live there, you just fall in love with it. They're interesting people, Turkish people. They seem quite formal at first, but very complex history, enormously complicated history. And if you love history, which I do, it's one of the sort of motivations for me to be in journalism. There is almost no better place to be than Istanbul. I mean, it's just such an incredible. I mean, the ancient history is amazing, but just what's happened to Turkey since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, its kind of isolation without really having a very strong international identity. It's kind of evolution as a state with a lot of unhappiness. It's still not really a very settled state. And then its attempt to kind of re-engage with the Arab world, which happened around the time of the Arab uprisings, is really interesting. But every bureau, the pace of work is dictated by the story. And you never know when you go to a bureau. It could be a big bureau. If you're in the BBC Washington bureau, there's huge numbers of people, 100 people working there. You never know. You never know whether it's going to be a busy one or not. Some bureaus always expected to be busy. I mean, the BBC has a bureau in Jerusalem. It used to be one of the busiest bureaus anywhere in the world because of the importance of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Jerusalem bureau was where it was watched, and it was huge, and it was busy, and the people were on air all the time. It's a whole lot quieter now. The center of attention has moved off. Bangkok, in general, has not been a busy bureau in the last 20 years because generally the countries here are relatively stable, even if they've got problems. But it is a disaster bureau. This region is prone to natural disasters. They've got high populations that are very vulnerable, and we need to be ready to go off and report those, as you know very well, the amount of time we spend checking that all our equipment is ready. And you never know. Some years you get 3 or 4 or 5 natural disasters. Some years you get none. Political unrest is the same thing. Nobody ever saw the political unrest that I covered in Indonesia in 1998 coming. The Jakarta bureau was really quiet when I moved there. It was a little sort of backwater. But by the time I left, there were colleagues of mine coming in. It was constantly busy. There were loads of journalists in there all the time. It just depends on the story.
So things change. Things sometimes it's busy, sometimes it's not. What would you say the biggest change and the evolution of journalism that you've seen through your time working, and what's the future? Where is it going?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. I mean, I can't think of many other professions that have been so turned on their heads by the impact of technology. And it's good and bad. So much when technology intrudes is. When I started in journalism, it was a fairly elitist club, particularly broadcast journalism, which is what I've done. I've not worked really in newspapers. I've worked in broadcast most of my career at the BBC. Broadcast in the old days, the technological challenges of just recording, editing, and getting broadcast stories, be they radio or TV, on air was such that only a relatively small number of companies could do it. Cameramen routinely traveled around with equipment worth $100,000 or $200,000, very heavy. They needed a lot. It was just the whole thing was such a palaver. And whenever there was a story, you got to it. You're very rare to be there when the story happened. So often we were doing stories, you'd hear about them, by the time you got there, it was all over. You'd always have to do stories that explained what you thought happened. As no one had phones in those days, and almost nobody had a camera, there was never any video footage. But what you did have as a broadcast journalist was a kind of privileged monopoly. If you got a TV story out of a place, a video story, especially if you got some action in there, the chances are you and one or two other TV crews were the only people that had it. And so when you put that stuff out, even if it was days after it happened, none of the general public would have seen any of it. Even, relatively undramatic footage by today's standards would be considered amazing to see it. So, I think in a way it made us complacent. We lapsed into formulas for TV news. The TV bulletins didn't take a great deal of foreign news, and there were always certain things they liked. They loved natural disasters. They loved anything, the old term, if it bleeds, it leads. Anything with action, with war or drama in it, that would go near the top because they figure that excites the otherwise only half-watching news audience. Of course, there are always big international conferences. It was all very limited. And what's happened with technology is two things. One is that now there's video everywhere, and it isn't professional journalists who are getting it mostly. It's democratized journalism because everybody can record everywhere. These days, whenever something happens, 95% of what's recorded won't be recorded by journalists. But also because of web technology, it means that the ability to broadcast has now become democratized too. Anybody can set up their own personal news site. I mean, that's in effect what our IG and Instagram and TikTok and all of our social media apps give us the opportunity to be our own broadcasters, our own YouTube channels. And that's created a mass of material, but without the sense of curation. The elite. When I started being a journalist, I was a very skeptical journalist. I'd been very left-wing when I was younger. I was very influenced by the critiques of people like Noam Chomsky of the established media. Chomsky always argued that the established media, for all of their liberal good intentions, had failed to call the US out, for example, on foreign policy acts that were unacceptable, like the bombing of Cambodia or the Vietnam War. And I came in with that attitude. But in the end, the media, there was a kind of liberal consensus. People tried to be fair and just, but we were very influenced by human rights. We tended to be skeptical of governments. Now people, whatever your point of view, extreme right, extreme left, you can create a very compelling news site of your own. And that means that for the ordinary public, they can see something that's just as compelling and interesting to watch that might come from a very extreme and very unfounded point of view. And there's less trust in the mainstream media. So on the one hand, we've been outflanked. We've lost a lot of our audience because their attention's being spread across this massive social media material output. On the other hand, because they're seeing so many different points of view put very persuasively, they're starting to say, well, maybe I don't trust the sort of mainstream point of view put by the media anymore. So we're also losing that level of automatic trust. People say, oh, well, the media may not be right. And the ability to catch us out is there. The media always made mistakes. They were often complacent and not good enough in acknowledging their mistakes and their limitations. But nowadays, the moment you make a mistake, you can get caught out. Somebody can fact check it. And so, the status of the media and our role has been challenged like never before. And it's hard to know how we come out of that. I think the argument for a well-trained, professional and idealistic media that holds to those really important principles, idealism, skepticism, balance, fairness, that's still really important. And the best exemplars of that, the big media who hold to these principles, I think have to stand for them and have to defend them. But whether we sustain enough broad public support is still a very open question.
So you brought up a really interesting point, which is like consensus in the media and how, I've been asked this a lot, is there like a consensus at BBC? Do people tell you have to do something? I've never been told anything. I've never been given a point of view. We report and that's it. So what is where did this fake news start and how can we combat it? Do we need to combat it or just keep doing our job? And
well, fake news, of course, is it's a term that's only existed in the last 5 years, and what is fake news? Initially, when we heard the term fake news, what we understood it to be was people using the access that social media and the web gave them to create what looks like authoritative news, but actually is based on total falsehoods and is deliberately false. It's meant to mislead. I'd say that is fake news, something that looks like news, properly reported and researched reporting, but one that's actually got an agenda and is deliberately distorted or falsified. But of course, the term is now used essentially by people for anything they disagree with. It's almost been devalued. I think the idea about consensus, I think that's not true. You look at the array of opinion that's in the mainstream media now. The reason I think that there is this idea that there's a consensus among the mainstream media is if you're an experienced journalist, you tend to understand that the world is very rarely black and white. It's in shades of gray. And also you begin to realize there's a lot of things you just can't know for certain. A few things you can. You're really aiming towards saying something decisive, but you've got to qualify. You're trying to be accurate. That tends towards moderation, towards caution. It can be frustrating for people who want easy answers, who say, hey, there's got to be an easy answer. And of course, what's happened with both politics and journalism is people have discovered that if they come in with a very dramatic, opinionated or straightforward answer to a problem and present it right, they get themselves a huge audience. Even if in the end it turns out that isn't the answer, they will be exciting and compelling and people will follow them. And the journalists who are saying, hold on a minute, it's not that simple, just aren't as exciting to watch. And I think that people tend to think, that's the consensus is the kind of complacency of the mainstream media who support the establishment. They're never willing to kind of call things out. There is caution among journalists because I think there's a realization the world is very complicated and you're supposed to provide a simple answer, but you can't. Some things you think are straightforward. Okay, if I go back over things I've covered in my life, one of my earliest experiences was as an editor working in London, was covering the Bosnian Civil War. That one I realized was enormously complicated. And I've read and read and read since then. And I still, we used to get quite cynical. We couldn't think of anything new to say about it. It was a horrible, ghastly human tragedy. There were definitely some really evil people involved there, some really nasty pieces of work. And yet it was not straightforward. And there were no easy answers. After one of the other stories we covered back then, again, reporting from London, was the genocide in Rwanda. And the absolute horror of that still lives with me. Of course, I didn't go there. I know people who did. But just the idea that in the idealistic 1990s, when we thought the Cold War was over, the UN could go in and fix anything, that with the UN there, this wholesale slaughter, almost unparalleled in the modern world, could take place, left us absolutely chilled. And I think our reporting, for that sense, was very much black and white. It's an absolute unspeakable horror has taken place, and that's all you focused on, and the kind of almost incomprehensible evil of the people who carried it out. Even now, if you start looking at the Rwanda conflict from today's perspective, you'll find it was not that straightforward, that the winning side eventually, the Tutsi side, the current government in Rwanda that took over when the people who committed the genocide were driven out, then they're not innocent. They also played their role. And I think the more you cover events, the more you realize occasionally there's a black and white one, but most events are complex and in shades of gray. History is, we're still arguing about the history of pretty much everything that we can remember: the Second World War, the causes of it, the Cold War, the rights and wrongs of the European Union. We're arguing about those even now. But people want easy answers. I don't think there's consensus among the media, but I think the mainstream media will tend towards a kind of reasonableness and balance that may seem like they're all conforming. They're not guilt-free. I mean, the media, go back to the Iraq War, the media did not challenge the Bush administration anything like, or the Tony Blair administration, toughly enough, and they should have done more. We should have done more. We had doubts. I think journalists are human. I think we were all very influenced by the shock of 9/11. When watching 9/11 happen, it was, the point about 9/11 was 9/11 was a drama. It was a horror and it was a ghastly, act of terrorism, but it was also beyond spectacular. Nobody'd ever imagined somebody would do that, and yet they did. And because it shocked people so much, it gave a sense of this has changed the rules completely. Nobody even questioned the right of the Americans to go in and invade Afghanistan, overthrow the Taliban regime, we all got wrapped up in, oh my God, something must be done. And I think there was still an element of that when the Iraq war happened, even though by then people were saying, hold on a minute, do we really need this? Is this necessary? Nobody particularly liked Saddam. But the questions were not tough enough. And I think the media failed. And we've failed many times. It's very easy for us to be consumed by the moment. Look at COVID-19 now. We're consumed now. We must have lockdowns. We've got to beat this thing. But we do have to stand back sometimes and say, hold on a minute. Is that the right way of looking at it? And perhaps more than anything of those 4 values I mentioned, skepticism should be the one at the top of the list for all journalists. Why is this bastard lying to me, even if it's somebody that you think is brilliant and that you like?
Definitely. And I was going to ask you actually about the COVID also in that sense, because, 2 things. So I want to bring back about also 9/11 and COVID and these big events that happen, and how will COVID be remembered in terms of, this is a big global event, and how often have you seen these? But then
there's nothing parallel with this one, is there? Because we don't know when it's going to end, do we? But I think
but in terms of like these big life world-changing events,
9/11 is the right parallel to make here. After 9/11 happened, those of us watching it, we can all remember where we were when we saw those planes flying into the World Trade Center. We did think at that moment, oh my God, the rules have changed. Nothing's ever going to be the same again. But of course, in the end, a great deal was the same again. And a great many mistakes were made because people thought the normal rules have been suspended. Perhaps that is a lesson we need to learn now. COVID-19 has had a profound impact on our world. It's certainly going to knock the economy sideways. Everyone's worrying about those of us who have them, their savings for retirement or whatever. It has all sorts of effects on us, their job security, their kids' education. All of us are affected. And it is very hard to stand above it and say, how's it going to be? I really don't know. I hesitate to say, everything will get back to normal. But of course, I suspect most things will. I think, of course, we will find a way to deal with this virus. There's enough human technology, and it's deadly, but it's not completely wiping entire communities out. We will adapt, and we will probably adapt in a way that 95, 98% of what we did before can still be done. It will certainly knock off some easy paths to prosperity. It might raise questions, but I hesitate again. We think these great dramas are going to make people change their views. Will people question the globalized consumer society? They were already questioning it anyway. The 2008 financial crash made people do that. Not profoundly, but with that and climate change, people were asking questions, but it couldn't change the way our societies and economy run. The systems are locked into place. Big business tends to dominate the world economy. People who get very, very wealthy tend to get much, much wealthier. Will that change now? I'd be interested to see whether there are profound changes. I'm not sure, because I think people will be exhausted by this. They're enduring these lockdowns. They're enduring their personal trials. And then as it eases off, they'll be desperate to get back to some kind of normality to the way things were. Sure. But you never know. None of us has ever really predicted crises that have come along. Perhaps the Second World War was more or less predictable, but even its form certainly wasn't. The First World War seemed to come out of the blue. The end of the Cold War, we began to see signs of it, but when it came, it was very, very fast and very sudden. I think it's a fool's errand to predict quite what this thing will do.
Yeah, and how you're talking about like uncertainty with life and the lockdown. That's why I was speaking to Naomi about this. It's easy for me to want lockdown because I have still an income. I'm still going to be okay. But I'm looking at, there's protests in America. I'm sure there'll be protests in other places that people want to get back to work. And I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is. Like continue lockdown or, because I'm for health, yeah. But when, like here, how many people have lost their jobs and filed for unemployment?
I think this is one area where we can say that no government has the answer.
Yeah.
Lots of governments are being praised for certain aspects of their response. The brilliant high-tech testing of the South Koreans and the Germans. The kind of ruthless quarantining of the Vietnamese. They're very, very efficient at curbing it. But in the end, the real question people want to know is the virus is still with us. It's not going away. There won't be a vaccine for at least a year, we don't think. There are no really effective treatments. So, we've only been with this thing for 3 months now. How are we going to live with it for the next 12 months in ways that are less disruptive than they have been up to now? And I think that getting that balance right between trying to contain the virus and yet maintaining economic activity, we have to do that. We've got to get that balance right. For every country, this is a massive economic shock. But for countries that have no social safety net, look at Thailand, the level of household indebtedness is huge. Huge enough, most Thais, and they're better off than in many neighboring countries, but most of them live off marginal incomes. They earn just about enough. They actually don't even earn enough to get through the day. They're in debt. They might pay off their debts. They've got to pay off their motorbike they might have. They'll be paying some kind of rent. They'll have a little bit left over for food, pay the food for schooling for the kids, clothes, nothing else. When this stops, they hit hardship straight away. And so all governments are having to make this calculation now. And I think, all of our news coverage, it's funny how we go in waves. All our initial coverage was on the disease and how much it spreads. Then it was on, oh my God, lockdowns. Are we doing them fast enough? And then all the questions there have been, particularly in Britain and the US, was the government too slow? Did it do the right thing? Has it been in denial? That's all going on, and inevitably it will, and we'll keep asking these questions forever. But in countries like Thailand, it's a very authoritarian system here. It's in the culture, and particularly with this government and the way they've declared a state of emergency, it's sort of father knows best. The government sits in secrecy discussing, we never know what their basis of their decisions are, and then suddenly out come these edicts, do this, do that, lockdown, not so much of a lockdown. But they must be thinking about the economic impact on ordinary people and how long they can last. And perhaps they need to be more honest. Perhaps more governments need to come out and say, we could do more. We could be strict with the lockdown. We are really worried about COVID-19, but we're also worried about the enormous costs of the lockdown going on and the costs to people's health, their psychological well-being, the sort of well-being within their families, the sort of happiness of their families. Those things aren't generally counted the way that body counts and deaths from COVID-19 are counted. And they will need to be thinking about those. It's very, very tough decisions. There's not enough good information to be making those decisions. And even when there is, they're trade-offs, and they're not comfortable trade-offs.
Okay, great.
And perhaps as journalists, we need to, as journalists, our jobs are to call governments to account. Whatever governments are doing, even if broadly they're doing a good job, it is our job to go in and say, because governments are always going to blow their own trumpets. That's what they do. Fair enough. Government's doing even a small part of a good job, they will go out and say, what a wonderful job I'm doing. Listen to how many times President Trump goes on about closing, airspace to China in late January. It is the job of journalists to say, fine, but you always need to be doing a better job as a government. We're here to chase your tail, and let's look at all the things you're not doing. And then of course governments say, oh, the journalists, they're so unfair, they're only ever going about the negative stuff. But it is our jobs to do that. But perhaps within that context of calling governments to account, we do also need to acknowledge to citizens that we know that these are really, really tough decisions made by exhausted government officials, many of them putting in long hours, which don't have easy answers. And while governments could do better, nobody knows what the right answer is.
Definitely true. We will see. We will see what happens. Okay. All right, Jonathan. I want to break off into like a fire round.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions. So first, the best thing about journalism and this industry.
The best thing about journalism, being a frontline journalist, as I am, is the immense privilege you have of being a witness to dramatic events. Sometimes at a personal level, you know, you're seeing drama inside somebody's family. It's always a privilege to have a window into every aspect of what makes humanity tick. And we get a better window than most people do. And it is a privilege. You know, we ask people to let us come into their lives, often at the very worst moments. You know, we intrude in areas where there are crises going, where ordinary citizens can't go, and we get a window and a view. And that, to me, is the best part about being a journalist. For the industry, it's camaraderie. Journalists love their jobs mostly, and most of them know how damn lucky they are to have them and to be in this profession. And, you know, we share that sense of privilege, and we also share the dramas we've shared together. You know, we've been in amazing situations with colleagues. You never get better friendships than the friendships you form through sharing those visceral, really life-forming experiences.
Sounds great. Okay, and then one piece of advice you would give to yourself when you first started that you could give to somebody else as they are starting out.
I would say, I've given this advice before, that everywhere you are, there are stories worth telling. Journalism is stories. It's about, you know, whatever's happening out there is meaningless to people until it's turned into a story. And our job is to do that. It's to give people stories that they want to follow, to learn from. You know, that's my view, is whatever beat you've got as a journalist, whether you're on a war front line or whether you're doing a local city beat or you're just working in a local government beat, whatever it is, there are always stories, and they're generally always human stories. Look for them. You can travel on your regular route to work, on a train or whatever, and look around you, and every person around you, however bored and tired they look, has a story. And our job is storytelling, finding the ones that mean something and tell people something.
Love it. Cool, Jonathan. I don't know. I think that's kind of about it. What do you think?
I'm sure we could go on talking for hours and hours, and by that stage, whatever audience we have will have long gone off to have a drink, make a cup of tea, or gone to sleep.
I think this is great. Hopefully we'll do this again. I mean, these are fun. Yeah. So
they are. They're brilliant.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Very much. No, it's. I don't think the great thing about my job is, you know, I've been doing it for more than 30 years, and I never stop learning. You know, there's so much I still have to learn. I need to live to be about 300 years old before I'll ever be any good at it.
I love that.